Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here with a special guest. We have Colonel Chris Mayer, the Associate Dean for Strategy and Initiatives at West Point. Chris is also a philosopher focused on future-ready leadership and leadership development, future of work, future of education. He's a fantastic follow on LinkedIn. That's how we initially connected. And he's actively engaging future military leaders in working in the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we're all living in. So that's the VUCA acronym that we're going to be diving into more fully. One last note is that the views expressed herein are those of the author, so in this case, Chris, and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of the Army, or the Department of Defense. So, Chris, that's quite an introduction. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah. So, like I was mentioning, Chris, you do a lot of thinking about where the world is heading. And you do that as an individual. I guess you're a trained philosopher as well as a trained Army officer. But a lot of what you and I have been talking about coming into this is about how the world has changed since maybe the Cold War era, when strategic planning and thinking about the future was less volatile and uncertain, and all the things we were talking about. That's where this VUCA acronym, sort of emerged, and that's been something that you've been focused on, and then you shared with me the first chapter of a really interesting book, by Bob Johansen, which is the new Leadership Literacies. Which is talking about how the way we should think about leadership has changed because the world has changed as it's become more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So I learned the acronym. So I at least did that level of prep.
Right.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what VUCA is and why it's relevant to teaching leadership today?
No, thanks. No, that's a good question. It's the idea that as you encounter the world, that traditional planning is not sufficient to be successful, to thrive in the world. That change is happening so quickly now that you really have to, and you can't predict it. You can be ready for it, but you can't predict it. Mm-hmm. That you really have to apply a new approach to leadership, mm-hmm. and a new approach to preparing organizations to move ahead. And this type of leadership isn't the traditional command and control hierarchical, but it's, Johansen talks about shape-shifting organizations, and, mm-hmm. and really he's asking leaders to in some ways be futurist and to help their organizations look into the future, and then kind of from possible futures they see to help the organizations change and prepare. And again, not being able to predict, but just be ready for the future.
Yeah. And it definitely, it's something we talk about a lot on this show, which is about, trying to understand trends in education. One thing we haven't spent a ton of time on is leadership development. And that in many ways is really the thrust of your focus, if I'm right. So can you talk a little bit about what leadership development is and how you think about it, and how you have engaged with it historically, and how you're thinking about really the future of leadership development?
Sure. I mean, at West Point, we ground everything in character, and we think that that's essential for ensuring that you're headed in the right direction and living by organizational values. Mm-hmm. But I mean, for us, what it means is we're preparing future officers, and we're providing a foundation, and we can't teach them everything that they're going to encounter. Like for instance, technology, it's changing so rapidly, we can't teach them what to expect in 5 and 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
but we're really developing a foundation of being open-minded, being adaptable, being uncomfortable with uncertainty, and being able to make decisions within that space of uncertainty and volatility. And in many ways, it takes the shape of a traditional curriculum, but it's how you communicate the expectations of what at least our graduates will do after they graduate and the environment they'll enter into. It is providing them, especially in training, with scenarios that challenge them and make them make decisions without complete information or almost too much information. But even in the classroom, it's using examples that they're maybe on the technological edge, maybe the idea of weaponized information and how you respond to that, or even just as a philosopher, thought experiments that make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The traditional trolley problem where you talk about would you pull a lever to kill 1 to save 5,
right?
And just getting them to really just be comfortable making decisions in the space of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And really the big thing we're focused on now is ensuring that after graduation, they're continuing to learn, continuing to recognize that what they learned here as leaders, they'll need to continue to learn. And it won't always be residential or won't always be organizationally provided, but that they can go out and learn new things and to really read a lot and discuss a lot with others.
Yeah, and you do seem, at least from what I've seen from you on LinkedIn, like you do seem to be modeling that behavior yourself, because you do seem really plugged into what's emerging in sort of the futurist space, particularly around strategic planning and developing leaders. I think you mentioned this maybe during our prep. I really liked the turn of phrase, but teaching leaders how to think, not what to think.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So, we have a tremendous, a very robust core curriculum where they have 27 required courses, and it's not a menu item like many, but it's the same economics course, same philosophy course that they all take.
Yep.
And really, they are exposed to philosophical ideas in economics, but it's really getting used and exposed to how economists think, how philosophers think, and bringing these different perspectives in themselves to challenges that they face. But then also as they go into depth in a particular discipline, bringing that expertise they develop into a group where you have a shared understanding of, like, I may not be an engineer, but I've taken 3 engineering courses, so I understand how engineers think. And so we can communicate and really confront this seemingly unsolvable problem and address it together. Yeah,
it reminds me as a Star Trek fan, it took me immediately to the Kobayashi Maru test, which was when James Tiberius Kirk was placed in a scenario that was supposedly no win, and the clever little joke there is that he hacked the scenario generator to actually enable a winning scenario. But what I found interesting about that example is that in many ways you want to understand how a leader will perform in an extremely adverse scenario. And I think frequently when you go into a planning phase and in a management setting, in a corporate setting, you're doing a lot of strategic planning. Frequently you're thinking about how everything will go according to plan. Right. And we all know that's unrealistic. It's typically helpful. I did mention, there is a book called Farsighted by Stephen Johnson, which I read recently, which was pretty interesting, where it talks about trying to make long-term strategic decisions. And interestingly, a lot of that did move into a scenario-based mode of thinking, which is something that I think is very central to West Point's curriculum, the things that you're teaching, and then also the War College, which is
Right.
really where Bob Johansen had his experience that then led to this book that we're referring to. I think there's a lot to be said for scenario-based thinking. And then in Farsighted, Stephen Johnson recommends always thinking about good scenarios, bad scenarios, and weird scenarios.
Right.
So that, and the weird one is kind of funny, but it's almost like, expect the unexpected. And I imagine when you're designing some of these scenarios and thought experiments, frequently you need to bring in something outside of what might be normally preconceived, and then see how the learner sort of grapples with that and ideally can respond in a timely and decisive way. Could you talk a little bit about the scenario-based aspect of this? I think it does blend a little bit into simulations and gaming, which I also thought was a really interesting aspect of what was in the new Leadership Literacies
Right.
book. But can you talk about, like, because I imagine that's a big part of military training, is being able to understand scenarios and potential scenarios so that should they arise, you don't freeze up. You actually know how to be responsive and present and able to make good decisions.
No, it's very much a part of both the training and military that cadets get here, and then they'll take their units through. And we have the many training centers, like the National Training Center, where they really do fight a mini war.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is to throw things at them that they didn't expect. I mean, and they throw civilians on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not always a standard military on military fight.
Mm-hmm.
And really what we hope by going through these scenarios that they come to expect and learn that the world isn't, is the unexpected will happen, that
Mm-hmm.
What they learned in preparation for the exercise, the scenario, there'll be something that's unexpected. And so it's not to cause the idea that you should not plan, but it's the idea to be ready and to be adaptable. But then really the important part is as they go through those and as they make decisions and take their organizations, as they try to resolve problems that they encounter, is to get feedback. The Army is very big on after action reviews. Yep. And asking why you made a particular decision, mm-hmm. and then giving leaders and organizations a chance to reflect on what they did and what they can learn from what they did, mm-hmm. And then using that to better prepare. Mm-hmm. And really outside of the military context, I've seen a lot of people talk about the value of science fiction. Mm-hmm. A lot of corporations now are having people come in and write scenarios that are future-based, and then looking at those scenarios and thinking, what does that mean for us today? I mean, they're not predicting the future, but they're developing possible futures, mm-hmm. and then walking backwards and thinking, how can we best be ready to take advantage of that? Yeah. And Johansen talks about dilemma flipping, and mm-hmm. and I think with scenarios you see, wow, this is a really tough problem, but he talks about flipping the dilemma as much as possible into an opportunity, mm-hmm. or maybe an opportunity and a threat. And I think through scenarios you really see how that's possible, and if done properly, you learn and get the idea that you may never see this scenario again, but what you've learned to do is to deal with the unexpected. Yeah. And make the best of it.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of what I've read about creativity as well, where, like, generally when you're trying to solve problems and trying to instill creativity within your team, it's frequently beneficial to look for multiple ways to solve a problem rather than think about the single best. Right. And I think that's sort of the evolution of thinking that I'm picking up on out of a lot of this, is that if you're trying to overfit to sort of an optimal scenario,
Right.
once you go, because life will happen, uncertainty is out there, wacky variables are always ready to manifest themselves. And if you can only operate in sort of that perfectionist, uh, everything goes exactly according to plan, when something, I mean, I think about the SEAL Team 6 operation, where like a helicopter was lost, like that's something that, the planning going in is, probably thinking about the pre-mortem, as well. Like
Right.
what could go wrong,
Right.
and even if the exact thing that goes wrong is not what you had anticipated, you're at least going in with the situational awareness that things that I'm not expecting to go wrong will go wrong, and my job as a leader is to be aware, responsive, and then sort of flexible in my thinking so that we still can accomplish the mission.
Yeah, the Army has a couple sayings, which is nice because it just puts people in that mindset that no plan survives first contact with the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
and that the enemy has a vote. So you
Yeah.
can have the best plan in the world, but the enemy has a vote on how that plan plays out.
Yeah.
So it's, in some ways, it's built into our ethos of kind of being adaptable.
Yeah, for sure. And also built into your ethos is cool acronyms. So
Right. We love
I did want to
acronyms.
at least mention, the Army also responsible for FUBAR and SNAFU, which are
Right.
two of my favorites, maybe because of the FU part,
Yeah,
but we'll try to keep it clean.
right.
But VUCA is certainly interesting, and honestly, like, you whetted my appetite with that first chapter of Bob Johansen's book, the new Leadership Literacies. I really do want to dig in further, but I thought we could maybe touch on some of the ideas that are outlined there. One of the things that he begins with is, sort of 5 components to what he thinks makes sense in terms of training future leaders. And I'll run through the list real quickly and maybe get some of your thoughts on it. One is to learn to look backwards from the future. And in that case, the future is frequently 10 years into the future. So like right now, we would be thinking about where might we be by 2030, which is really beyond where, strategic planning in organizations typically is somewhere in the 3 to 5 year range if you're doing it right. So like expanding that time horizon to 10 years, I think is really interesting. The second one is voluntarily engage in fear, which is like a kind of provocative frame there. But I think that's the importance of scenario-based thinking, wargaming, some of the things that we discussed just now. Embrace the shape-shifting organizations, which you talked about earlier, Chris. So that's more, the world is just rapidly moving towards more distributed, decentralized organizational structures rather than the traditional hierarchical command and control. That's where, really post 9/11 is where a lot of this stuff really picked up. And that's where you think about a lot of these terrorist organizations. It's not as clear that there is a command center that you knock out and then victory is yours. Frequently, there's ways for those sort of non-hierarchical structures to kind of like metastasize and perpetuate and be a lot harder.
Very resilient.
Yeah, exactly. So in some ways, the wargaming requires us to adopt some of the structural thinking that those organizations have adopted. There's also, there is the model of holacracy, which we've talked about at times, where like there are organizational structures that are emerging that I think are similarly distributed and non-hierarchical. And that's an interesting trend that we have talked to a few folks about on this show. And I thought that there's potentially some ties in there. Number 4 is be there even when you're not there. So that's, expand beyond the limitations of face-to-face management, face-to-face leadership. Understand that you need to be able to lead when you're not in the same physical space, even when you're not necessarily communicating in real time. There's a lot to talk about there. And then the 5th one I thought was really interesting, which is to create and sustain positive energy. And that's hugely relevant to a lot of the things that we talked about here, but particularly around social and emotional learning, understanding that, the whole the whole officer, the whole leader, it needs to engage in an authentic way with the folks that they're leading, and mustering the energy and sort of the psychological power, I guess, to be positive even in really dangerous and negative scenarios. That one in particular I was interested in, but I don't know if you wanted
Sure.
to dig in on any of this.
No, and I think his first principle there, learn to look backwards from the future,
Mm-hmm.
does he's a futurist, and he thinks that that approach is it's much more fruitful than, like you said, the traditional strategic planning 3 to 5 years out.
Yeah.
And he says in some ways that's actually easier to work that far out rather than closer out, because as you look for signals and put them together, you're not trying to predict as 3 to 5 years, but you're just trying to be ready. And in some ways that's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard someone from his the Institute for the Future talk about, as you look 10 years out, you have strong opinions lightly held.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always open-minded, willing for them to change, but using that to help guide the organization and help prepare the organization.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really like, and I think is especially useful for leadership in the civilian world, is this idea of being there when you're not there.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes through in the book, and with the idea of remote work, the idea of gig work, people working that aren't really with your company. Traditionally, big corporations had someone there who had 30 years.
Yeah.
And then they retired, got a gold watch, and left.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're seeing people either not being at the office,
right,
part of the company, or not part of the company and not at the office, or at the office, not part of the company really, but a contractor.
Yeah.
And so he really makes thoughtful analysis of leaders selecting the best way to communicate to their teams. And he talks about same time, same place, different time, different place,
mm-hmm.
same time, different place. I mean, he goes through all these and because of course culture and cohesion are important, and getting everyone headed in the same direction and committed to the mission of the organization is essential, even if you have remote workers.
Right.
Of course, it's much harder because you're not looking at them face to face.
Sure.
Traditional sense.
Yeah.
So I found that really helpful
mm-hmm.
For today's environment.
Yeah.
And then finally, the last thing, the creating positive energy. He stresses again and again, the leader faced with this uncertain world,
mm-hmm.
kind of being the messenger of hope. That
yes.
Look, we may not be able to predict the future, but we can get ready for it, and we can move the organization forward.
Mm-hmm.
And really thinking about, I know a lot of civilian colleges now are thinking about leadership and thinking about the future of work.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, really that's not something you learn and get on a multiple choice test, this idea of how to inspire hope.
Yeah.
It is something that's essential that leaders will need in the future.
Yeah, that one particularly struck me. Also, just as someone who's worked with folks at different points in their career, one of the things that I've read a bunch about is how the rising generations, in particular Gen Z and millennials, are really expecting to be inspired.
Right.
Otherwise, they may not stay with your organization. They may not even come to your organization to begin with. And at the same time, they're also looking for authenticity. So like, I think
mm-hmm.
there is, there's an element of it which may be faking it until you make it. But like, I think that there's an aspect of it that is, it needs to be authentic. And I think that's the subtle art of genuine leadership. And I think increasingly that's what distinguishes, the missionaries versus the mercenaries, like the people who are in an organization because they care about it. Those folks want to be led, but I think the way in which leadership manifests nowadays is a little more subtle and more about soft skills and authenticity.
It is.
So that one, that one I really that one resonate. They all resonated with me, and I do want to get into more that's in here, but that just seemed like a next level insight.
Yeah, and I think colleges are, by focusing a lot on getting their students out of the classroom and getting them to apply what they've learned, and in many cases doing it with community organizations that are tackling tough problems.
Yeah.
They well, one, they learn to apply what they've learned in the classroom. So sort of the creativity you gain by studying poetry and dealing with that ambiguity, take out and work with a community organization trying to tackle a tough problem. But they also see leadership in that context, and the idea that these community organizations working on very tight budgets, working on problems that aren't going to go away in a week or a year, they see it modeled, and hopefully they internalize that and see themselves as being that one day.
Yeah. And it's also like, trying to understand how to find that place within yourself as a leader to change the frame. Like it's like I've heard there's a Martin Luther King quote, you want to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. So like you're not just reading the spirit of the troops and the sort of the vibe of your team and sort of buying into it. It's like you're driving the emotional health of your team, and it's up to you to not break bad and to understand that there are always places to find hope. I just found that inspirational. Moving on, just within the chapter, the two other things I wanted to talk quickly about. One is there's this quote where he says we're twisting towards distributed everything, which I think is a nice turn of phrase, which is basically there's increasing speed, frequency, scope, and scale of disruption. There's explosive connectivity coming that's even more than what we have today. And there's what he calls asymmetric upheaval. So like there's very few patterns of clear patterns of disruption. And then in response to that, again, wonderful turn of phrase. He says, you want clarity of direction and flexibility of action, know where to go, but be open about how to get there. And I think that that is a nice sort of way of encapsulating some of the sort of emerging thinking about leadership. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I don't know if his time at the War College, learning about mission command inspired that, but the Army has a philosophy called mission command. And what it's defined as is the exercise of authority and direction by the commander using mission orders. So saying what the mission is, to enable disciplined initiative within the commander's intent to empower agile and adaptive leaders in the conduct of unified land operations. And the commander's intent is really a clear and concise expression of the purpose of the operation and the desired end state. And so I think in some ways he is overlapping with that idea of kind of set direction of where you want to go, what you want to achieve, but be flexible in how you get there. But it does require that you have agile and adaptive leaders who are capable of exercising not just initiative, but disciplined initiative. They take prudent risk. And of course, all those words are loaded, right? Yeah, you need that's a lot of it's judgment, and there's often a danger with giving too much freedom, especially to inexperienced leaders. But we found that this idea of mission command is it allows better outcomes in the end, because the people on the ground know what works, as long as they're well trained and prepared. What works, as long as they know what the end state is and what the higher ups want. It was up to them.
It was interesting. What resonated with me too, there's stuff in here also about the importance of engaging diverse perspectives, and I frequently do think about the military as a place where diversity and inclusion is more directly addressed, and then good leadership. What I'm reading more in the private sector is benefiting from the diversity of perspectives and allowing for each party to sort of provide their unique value, And I hadn't, until I was reading through this, really made as strong a connection to that's very much how the military operates. So any
Yeah,
thought? Yeah, anything to add there?
it is. No, and I mean, um, I think it's especially important, not just for the military, but for everyone in
Yep.
today's world where there's actually much more information than there was 30 years ago. Like everyone becomes a source of information through LinkedIn,
Hmm.
Facebook. Um, but I think we're tending to, in some ways, only listen to, only receive information that kind of agrees with
Yeah.
our view.
Hmm.
You know, as you know, friends on Facebook or news sources start to adjust to what you're reading.
Yeah.
So I think Johansen's call for these diverse perspectives is essential because you have to remain open-ended or minded. And he
Yeah.
talks about not becoming too wedded to a particular point of view,
Yes.
which makes sense in a world that's constantly changing. If you have one perspective that you're using all the time and you're not listening to diverse perspectives and being willing to change, then you and your organization will run into problems. And of course, the military, the military always seeks to have frank, open discussions.
Hmm.
In wargaming, we always have a team that's kind of the devil's advocate to
Yep.
try to challenge and make you defend your proposed course of action.
Yeah.
But I think this point is even much broader than leadership almost.
Hmm.
And I hope colleges, universities are encouraging people to listen to diverse views, and maybe in the end you come back to what you believe, but to really seriously consider and evaluate differing opinions.
Yeah, and it's why I appreciate you putting yourself out there as someone with ideas that are relevant within the military context. But one of the things, as a sort of a future facing podcast, we frequently try to find insights from adjacencies and figure out how they can translate into a broader context. And I think I was struck as I was preparing for this, reading through some of this stuff and sort of looking at the things that you're sharing, that frequently, like, significant insights are coming out of the military mindset and the scenario planning in a post 9/11 world. And like, not all of that has necessarily permeated out into the rest of the educational ecosystem. So,
Right.
so that's why it's a credit to you that you're trying to expand access to some of the insights that are generally more built into the military education. And then the flip side also seems to be true, that like there are emerging ideas around thought leaders thinking about building teams, thinking about establishing ways to be creative, et cetera, that need to be incorporated into educating leaders and educating folks within the military. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just on how some of these ideas maybe don't get broad enough reach?
Um, I mean, one idea that I think that I've been reading a lot about, and it's been more the civilian sector,
Mm-hmm.
business sector, is this idea of forming and leading human robot teams.
Yes.
And I've seen a couple of studies that are very interesting and conflicting. I mean, one showed that workers were sabotaging robots because they were jealous and fearful of losing their jobs.
Yeah.
But in another country, they were actually almost too attached to them, that they were calling them, they named them, and they
Yeah.
were their friends.
Right.
And actually, you sometimes see that in the military with some of the robots we use.
Right.
Another study showed that, and it differed by country, but majority of people said they prefer a robot boss.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I might have seen you share that. In fact, that was fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, and then part of it was, look, that robots they're not grumpy, they don't get tired, they're not
Right.
biased,
Yeah.
they're fair, which
Yeah.
isn't exactly true. With AI, there's problems with bias, but they did say that humans better coaches, and that they can actually have conversations and they like their bosses.
Yeah.
I think those studies really suggest that I think for any leadership, that we really need to think about how we integrate technology into organizations, but also using it in ways that make leaders better. And
Yes.
hopefully, eventually that people won't say that they prefer robot bosses, but that they prefer that their leaders use technology
Mm-hmm.
and versus one that doesn't, so
Mm-hmm.
that maybe the leader makes fairer decisions and brings in better information to make decisions, but then they still value sort of the uniquely human aspect of leaders, the coaching, the interpersonal connection.
Yeah.
I think it was a bit troubling to see that so many people, and of course, I think if you really did switch to robot bosses, people would react to it. No one really likes the boss all the time. So it might
Yeah.
have been a reaction to just their latest encounter with their boss. But I really think how leaders think about just leading robot human teams is going to be a big area that we deal with the next 10 years.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. You had me at robots.
Yeah.
We loved talking about that. And we also, the narrative element of robot overlords and science fiction, I think can in fact be somewhat damaging.
Right.
And then also, the related point though is like the evolution of what it means to be human, as
Right.
a lot of the tasks that used to be human powered are becoming automated, whether through robots or just through automation in general. And then that's another area that I know you have plenty of thoughts on, because I've seen you share quite a few articles about this stuff. But like that's also where the skills and competencies that uh, humans should be focused on developing are changing. And that's another place where that sort of 10-year horizon, this stuff becomes hugely relevant then. Like, I have a 10-month-old at home, and it'll be 2 10-year horizons before he's probably entering the workforce. And that the nature of work in 20 years, like it's going to be so profoundly different than what it is today, primarily because of automation. But at the same time, like, the much will still be human powered. And then the blending of what is human and what is automated is the space that's super interesting. Because like, where do you what sort of skills do you want to bet on for like a long-term time horizon? And that's when you land more in, the adaptability, ability to make have some critical thinking applied to novel situations that you can make decisions. It's also where ethics is becoming increasingly interesting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it presents such a challenge for educators, either secondary, post-secondary, primary. But yeah, I think you're right that it's going to be things that uniquely human skills like adaptability, communication, connection between, and I think a lot of people are saying that it's not necessarily knowing, like everyone doesn't need to learn how to code, because in the future coding might be automated as well, but maybe it's more of an understanding of technology itself and how to keep up with it and integrate it into your work. But then of course, again, working on these uniquely human skills, but still being able to think about how, so if you're relying upon a machine to make a decision, how do you audit that decision? And how do you keep up with, to ensure that the process the machine was designed to do is being performed and the data being input is important. So that's going to be essential too. But no, I think you're right. I think just trying to keep up with what it is that people need to be able to do in 20 years is going to be the big challenge for educators.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of it's going to be these uniquely human skills.
Yeah, and I love that. I was going to go right where you went around decision making too. So like, the power of algorithms is wonderful, but it also can be disempowering in a dangerous way if we are basically seeding the entirety of our agency to something external, which particularly for leaders, there's a lot of complexity and subtlety to when do I want to leverage non-human agents to give me inputs, give me direction. That's one thing. A second level of that is to then see the decision making to the external agent, the external intelligence, and then I think the third level, which I think is hugely dangerous, is not doing the audit that you were describing. So like, for me, hashtag team human, not particularly comfortable. Like when YouTube sends me something, I'm like, nah, I'm gonna go my own direction, and I turn my spell I embrace my typos. I feel like that's who I am. But I've been really fascinated by this stuff, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you, because you really you've been somewhat inspirational to me in the short time I've been tracking you. Like, just continuing to lean into this complexity and grapple with it, and try to share some of these topics and ideas. We're pretty close to time. Any parting thoughts? Any other ideas to get out there as we're wrapping up?
I mean, just two quick things. We just bought a new van, and it's got the lane correction that automatically makes the decision to swerve back into the lane. And it's a bit disconcerting, because you've lost the control, and and so deciding whether to keep it on or off is a decision in itself. But I think, one thing I should have mentioned, as children grow up and even as they go to post-secondary education, obviously learning is going to be very important. Both knowing that you need to continue to learn, but also being able to learn and being able to maybe learn something just enough so you're not becoming expert in it, but that you have a basic understanding. And so kind of inspiring this idea of lifelong learning across education will be very important, but it's challenging, of course.
Yeah, we could go on and on, because now I was ready to talk about unlearning and other ideas for those of us as we get older. I think you and I might have gone back and forth a little bit on that on LinkedIn too, because it's lifelong learning is critical, but then that also means relearning and unlearning stuff you learned earlier in your life. It's one of those places where trying to put a little bow on top of this whole thing. I think it's great to find folks like yourself who are modeling a positive frame around this too, to get back to Johansen's idea, where like the world is so complicated, it's very VUCA, but also there are places to find hope and inspiration amidst all this complexity. And I just wanted to thank you, Chris, for taking the time. Wonderful conversation. If folks want to understand more about this, any thoughts on where you might direct them?
Yeah, I think following this idea of uniquely human skills, there's a lot being written on it. A lot of businesses are saying like that this is the area that they need to develop their employees in. And I think, as you mentioned, that's going to be what educators are, a lot of what they're focusing on. And so I think just those areas are the big things.
Awesome. So Colonel Chris Mayer out of West Point, wonderful follow on LinkedIn, really great thinker. If you can get exposed to his thoughts, I'd recommend it. Same thing to Bob Johansen's work, the new Leadership Literacies. There it is. I nailed it. Chris, wonderful time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I really enjoyed it. Enjoy your program. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And to our listeners, thanks again for listening. We'll be back on our regular cadence. So follow us anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Twitter @TrendingInEd, on Facebook, the same. And we'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.